Thank you so much for hosting this panel. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is so wonderful to join you. It's so wonderful to sit on this panel with some old friends. As Kay said, we're old friends and colleagues from the United Nations University days, and it's really difficult to appreciate the work that those folks do without having done it. This is just absolutely wonderful. I'm happy to convey my experience with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, coordinating the Working Group 2, which is Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, our treatment of the topic of migration and mobility. So I was a lead author for the chapter Poverty, Livelihoods, and Sustainable Development, but I also co-coordinated the cross-chapter treatment of migration across the entire report. And so we had some really interesting insights resulting from that process, both on the substance of climate change, migration, mobility, the sort of the themes, the evidence, weighing the evidence and conclusions, but also there's some very important implications resulting from the process that I'm hoping to convey to you. So I have a limited amount of time and I'll try to move through this very quickly. And the way that I wanted to frame it was around the text of the cross-chapter box on migration, that this across the review treatment, the subtext, which is this continual return to the theme of climate, migration, and conflict, and then suggest a couple ways forward. So just very quickly, in the framing of our review, the way that, so since the beginning of the IPCC, the first assessment, there has been a concern with the potential of climate change to render parts of the planet uninhabitable, to drive new patterns of migration as systems are disrupted because of climate change. And so one of the key issues of framing, the first statement we wanted to make on migration, to respond to this idea that climate change, that migration is some sort of pathology that would result in the context of climate change. And so our first and opening review statement responds to this. Migration is a universal strategy that individuals and households undertake to improve well-being and livelihoods in response to economic uncertainty, political instability, environmental change. High confidence, and we assign this language to all of our review statements. So no, migration is normal. It's absolutely normal. People across cultures, in almost every culture on Earth at different life stages, move and migrate as a totally normal part of life. Are outcomes of climate change impacts and migration environmentally determined? Again, no. So this should come as no surprise to any of you. Migration responses are strongly influenced by economic, political, social, political, and demographic processes. This is, Black et al., 2011. So, these are the starting points. It's normal. It's not environmentally determined. But when we think about mobility in the context of climate change, we can imagine a risk context in which people are living and experience climate change. And along comes a climate hazard. And in many circumstances, the response would include successful in situ adaptation. No mobility is required to adapt. And in these instances, risk decreases. But there might be instances in which mobility is part of a possible set of adaptation alternatives. And then we might see at a specific threshold, a decision in which mobility is part of adaptation. And so mobility may decrease risk, but it also might increase risk. And so then also we have to consider immobility along with mobility. So, this is our framing of it in the IPCC. None of this should be a surprise to any of you. And then what we did was we asked all of the sectoral and regional chapters to review migration. So in Central America, in South America, and North America, et cetera, Africa, there were all instances in which mobility and migration processes and characteristics were described. And so what we did as the author team was compile these into a typology, a sort of empirically based typology of all the instances of mobility across the chapter. So, or the report. And you'll see this in our box. There's this sort of neat typology with a little reference where you can find different instances of mobility. And again, the categories here are derived from the review itself. This is a very confusing figure, but what you'll see is on one axis, you have agency from low agency to high agency. And then on the other axis, you have sort of distance from local migration or mobility, internal, regional, and then global, short distances to long distances. And what this shows is that, that we're trying to convey a quantity, perhaps, of mobility that we might anticipate associated with climate change. And so most of it is very local. In fact, much of it is immobility. And so some may be internal to a country, a much smaller amount might be regional or international. So if we move through this typology, internal migration, international migration, indefinite or permanent migration, contrasted with temporary or seasonal migration. Next, we might imagine rural and urban migration, or rural to rural migration. And then lastly, these categories of concern: forced displacement and organized resettlement. So there's a lot we could say about the characteristics of migration, some general statements we originated on generalities, things we can generalize about migration in different ways. And there was a lot we could say about the mechanism, specifically livelihoods is an important mechanism for migration and mobility. And then also the instances in which forced displacement become a real category of concern, and the specific climate hazards that are driving forced displacement now and in the future. But I just want to go through this. Okay, lastly here, this was a really important sort of contribution of our work, is that we really put agency on the map as an important component of mobility. So never before had agency been defined, but had entered the glossary of the IPCC until our group came along and said, hey, this is a really important aspect of adaptation in general, but specifically mobility. And what we said was that the more agency migrants have, the more voluntarity and the degrees of freedom that they have in their mobility decisions, the greater potential benefits to them and to their hosts we might anticipate. So then the subtext, and I just want to conclude here. I don't have very much time. I think we had 7 minutes each, and I'm already at that. I've already reached my limit. But so again and again and again, when we did this assessment based on the evidence, right? People are writing on migration instances in their different regions and sectors. And what we consistently saw was this return to an idea that climate change causes migration, and this is somehow convolved in conflict. So we saw this as in the process of our review, but this was a structural component of the report itself. And so, the framers of the report, this entered chapter 16, which is one of the key risk framing chapters. There's a subsection on risks to peace and human mobility, conflating the issues around peace and human mobility. And so, through concerted effort, through lots of discussions back and forth with author teams, we finally managed to enter this little piece of text in the introductory paragraph, which says, basically saying, there are some specific risks to peace and mobility. However, evidence does not indicate that human mobility constitutes a general risk to peace. This is so important. We also decided to, I'm sorry, I'm over time, to enter this as in our cross report assessment, just because of the experience we had during the process, continually seeing this narrative emerge over and over again. So we put this in here with a confidence statement. Perceptions of migrants and the framing of policy discussions, I would say the framing of academic and policy discussions in receiving communities and nations are important determinants of the future success of migration as an adaptive response to climate change. And then we put a confidence statement there. we could have higher evidence on this, and this is a suggestion to all of you folks who are doing research on this stuff. Let's do some work on this. And then, so this is too involved to explain. Maybe I can come back to this, but in the IPCC, there is this idea, concept, representative key risks. When do risks become very severe? And how can we imagine severe risks associated with migration and mobility? And so Elizabeth Gilmore, myself, and some of the core team of this mobility assessment effort went on to write a paper where we really tried to think about when severe risk is really an issue associated with migration and mobility, and the concept of habitability, agency, and suffering sort of rise to the fore. So I'll just end here. Migration is normal. Migration is responsive to the way we frame it and the policy decisions we make about it, and that our research community really has an important job to do to push against anti-immigrant biases from within the global change research community. And we have to do this with evidence and better framing. And I'll just sort of leave it there. I'm so sorry for going over time.
Yes, thanks a lot, David. I forgot to say at the beginning of this session that we're going to have 5 presentations. We're going to have a slightly longer discussion at the end. But after each presentation, there is time, depending on the extent to which speakers go over time. There's like 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes for specific questions. Now, I'm not going to go around with the microphone, so just tell me your question, keep it short, and I will summarize it to Christian. So please keep it short because my memory is not so great. Yeah. Did you hear the question, David? No, right? So the question is, in the process in the IPCC process, were there certain concepts of migration that you were not able to take up in the report?
Well, that's a really good question. Yes, that's a very good question. Yeah, so we had to. It's just the IPCC process without getting too involved. It's all evidence-based, right? So we can only evaluate the evidence. And so if there is not evidence of a thing, then it's difficult for us to comment on it. And so one of the things I might suggest is that really one of the themes that really needs to be developed, this is, urgent. It's part of the inception of the IPCC. It's motivated by this notion that climate change could erode local habitability and habitability at larger scales. And yet we don't really have a clear empirical basis for understanding habitability. And so a few of us have been working on this concept. And so, I'm dodging the question a little bit. But if there isn't evidence for a thing, then we can't really assess it. And I guess that's how I'd answer it.